So it's a great pleasure to start the year off. We're a bit late, we're running into February, but to start the year off with Willie and Carel, and over the next 11 months, we will be discussing one of my favorite topics, the Book of Revelation. Now, what I really find fascinating about Revelation is that it everything comes full circle. You've got Jesus being born. You've got the fall of man. There's certain consequences that happens right through the Bible, and then at the end, Jesus appears again, brings justice and a new creation. So the beginning and the end leads to a new beginning. But I'm really looking forward to have a conversation about this, and I want to start with Willie. Any insightful comments?
Yeah, by Revelation is really one of those books in the Bible that I think most scholars and readers would prefer to tackle last.
And it often happens, eh?
Yeah, it's for most people quite a challenging book, and it's we should admit it. It's not easy to understand and interpret, and there are various views. We'll discuss it today, but I do think it's a fascinating book. And I've seen through the years that in general, the public and Christians are very interested in the book of Revelation. I myself have has written a book in 1995 is nearly 30 years ago, about the book of Revelation. And through the years, it stayed a very current topic. It's people are always discussing and asking questions regarding it. So I think it's quite timely that we also have a discussion on this book.
Absolutely. And I think, you mentioned that it's quite timely. I do see an increased interest in the book of Revelation, and it seems to be popping up all over, especially when you start doing some searches as well. What I do find interesting is the fact that I see very little real discussion on Revelation in our churches. And I don't know if Carel has any opinions on that.
Yeah, thank you, Lebay. It seems that people are afraid of the book of Revelation because they think it is extremely difficult, and they are afraid to really tackle it. Personally, I truly love the book of Revelation. I find inspiring and strengthen it, and actually the text on which the person preached when I gave my life to the Lord came from Revelation 3:20, quite well known. I'm standing at the door and I knock. If you open the door, I will come in. So although people are afraid of the book, it is really a magnificent book to study. But there are lots of different opinions on it, and conflicting opinions on how to interpret it. And yeah, so that will be part of the discussion we have to tackle to give a proper explanation of how we understand it and why we understand it the way we do. And I'm looking forward to really dive into it.
Yeah. So if someone like me that's interested, let's say I don't have a very broad knowledge of Revelation, and I feel that I should be studying it, what would be my starting point? Willie, in your book, you refer to authorship. You talk about the purpose of Revelation is to reveal. I mean, it's a massive amount of information and very daunting. What would you guys say is the starting point?
Yeah, so right in the beginning, we read that the purpose of the book is to reveal that which is hidden. So God, in this book, I believe, is giving us a prophecy about the future. This is what it means to reveal. that which is hidden towards the church, for the church. So this is definitely a prophecy. And if we read it as a prophetic book, it's actually in that sense that people often believe that maybe Revelation has in some way find application in our own day and age, maybe even in future times. But the fact that it's a prophecy is, I think, extremely important. So although it's often said that it's the kind of literature, it's an apocalyptic kind of literature, and I can agree with that in a certain sense, because if you describe that kind of literature as having a lot of symbolism, secret sites revealed, the kind of pessimism about the current state of affairs and the hope for future relief and God becoming involved in some way, then that's the typical way of thinking about apocalyptical literature. The book of Daniel is also seen in this way. But often scholars use this kind of understanding or literature type to negate the idea that this is actually prophecy. And I have heard scholars saying that this is not a book about speculations or a book on speculations about the future. Now, surely it's not speculations about the future, but for these scholars, mostly from the liberal schools, they do not think the book has anything to say for future generations. Now, I do believe that the book is first and foremost was directed to the people that John spoke to in this case. He gave the prophecy to the people and he himself within the context of his time. But we know that prophecy, godly, inspired, divine inspired prophecy, is not only applicable to the time and the period of the prophet, it's also applicable to future times. And I believe that a book of Revelation is such a book. Its application is not only for the people of that time, although some of the things, I think, it's St. John's own context, it's the world in which he lived. But once we see this as a divine revelation, and not only St. John's own ideas and descriptions of visions, that's just his own human effort, but we do see it as a divine revelation. In that case, it has a definite application also for all generations, if it's a prophecy and if aspects of the prophecy is still awaiting fulfillment. So at this stage, we're not really going into any school of interpretation. We'll do that a little bit later on. But we should have an open mind that the book of Revelation also concerns future events. We should not have a closed mind in this regard. If it's a real prophecy, as is clearly stated right in the beginning of the book, then that possibility is not only a possibility. That way of reading the book is, I think, extremely important.
Yeah. So initially it was written for the 7 churches, and they lived in the time of Dominus. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yeah, Dominus.
Yeah. And but it's also in a certain sense written for us as well.
Yeah.
Carel,
I can just add on what Willie said. You asked what is the starting point if you want to read Revelation. And for me, one of the most important places to start is how do you interpret the Bible? And I think especially with Revelation, it is important to really look at the meaning the scripture itself gives us, the most logic meaning you find in the text itself. For instance, these 2 texts, Revelation 1 verse 3, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy. So when Jesus spoke to John, he says, this is a prophecy. And blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. So time is also a key word when you talk about prophecy. And then also in chapter 1, verse 19, write therefore the things that you have seen, those that are and those that are to take place after this. So you can see it is pointing to current events and future events.
Yeah, and you find exactly the same in chapter 4, where John hears a voice saying, "Come up here and I will show you things which must take place after this." So it's future events that is revealed according to this.
But you will have lots of difficulty to understand Revelation if you don't know the rest of the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Because there are many symbols, many concepts used which come from the Old Testament. And it's like bring all the wires and all the lines together in conclusions. But I believe to understand Revelation properly, you have to know the Old Testament, and also there are many other prophecies in the Bible which link onto the prophecies you find in Revelation, so that it actually confirms what is already said on some prophecies, but there are also new prophecies you find in the book. So an honest read and referring back to the rest of the Bible, I believe, will help you to understand it.
Because the Old Testament points to the New Testament, and the New Testament basically reflects back to the Old Testament.
Yeah, there are nearly not a verse in Revelation that's not in some way linked or connected or taken from the Old Testament.
Yes.
And as we proceed, we won't go into that kind of detail, a word-by-word explanation or so, but it'll definitely come out in our discussions. What I can mention regarding prophecy, it's also important to know who's the prophet. So in this case, it's St. John, and we believe that it's actually the apostle. And the reason why we believe it is that Justin Martyr has actually said this in about, already 40 years after the time of St. John that he has written the book. So we have very good reason. This is one of the earliest references, or the earliest reference to the book. And it said that it's the apostle that wrote the book. So we believe that the book was written by St. John, the apostle. And we believe that it was written in about 96 AD. We know it was a time of great tribulation. There are various references, especially in chapters 2 and 3, to the to tribulation, difficult times, and so forth. And there were, in the early period, there were two main difficult periods of persecution of the church. The first was in the time of Nero, Caesar Nero, and the second one was in the time of Caesar Doctavianus. And that was about 86 or around there till 96. It was that period. So most scholars agree that it was during the persecution of Domitianus that the book was written. And if it's John the Apostle, we have even more reason to believe that it's really divine inspired, and it's, as Carel has actually very nicely shown from 1 verse 3 prophecy we're talking about.
And that's what we believe, it's divinely inspired. Sorry, go ahead, Carel.
I also heard some criticism that the Greek we find in Revelation differs a lot from the other letters John has written, and even the Gospel is written. But I also found a very interesting explanation for that in this book of David Pawson, Unlocking the Bible, but he also comments on Revelation. He said that John was not actually the author. He says he was merely helping with this word, amanuensis. He actually just took down, find the command to write down what he'd seen many, many times. So he actually had to write, some of the Bible authors had somebody else writing down their words. I think Paul had somebody like that. Now, John was writing down somebody else's words, and it was the angel, it was actually Jesus's words, which came from heaven. So in that sense, the Lord himself is actually the author, and John just wrote it down so hurriedly that in the end, it was not such a polished document as his letters or his gospel. But yes, it is indeed, we believe, the Apostle John that wrote down what he received.
Yeah.
I can just mention that the Greek used in Revelation, as you have said, Carel, is strongly influenced by Hebrew. So it's clearly a Hebrew speaker, natural Hebrew speaker that wrote the book. And the belief is that actually St. John, while on Patmos, didn't have the assistance of good Greek speakers that they had with writing, for example, the epistles and so forth, the epistle and the letters. But so in this case, he was on his own, and that's why we find this. So there's a good explanation for that, as you've mentioned.
Yeah. When we talk about Revelation, I think it's really worthwhile to also discuss I want to say, the more secular viewpoints on this. And I know before we started the recording, we were sort of touching on that. Can you sort of give us an overview of that, Willie? And I almost want to say, why is it something that we shouldn't take seriously?
Yeah, so there are basically four views. So we in our discussion will not follow one particular view. We will have a criticism of the various views, and we will just try to have a kind of independent discussion. It's not totally in the sense of objective, because everyone has certain preconceived ideas and so forth. It's totally impossible to be objective in this regard, but we will try to find the best solutions and answers to understanding the text. So the first view is, I maybe start with that, is the preterist view. Now, the preterist view believes that the book of Revelation is actually, in a certain sense, history writing. It was written afterwards. So St. John wrote things that happened before that time. And they would say, so it's actually, say, related to the period of Nero. Scholars from this school would often believe that the beast described in Revelation refers to Nero. So they are of the opinion it's not really prophecy. It was written after the events, and it referred to these events during the early Roman period. Now, the problem is, for example, take Nero. According to the book of Revelation, the beast had a mortal wound. He was revived. And now Nero didn't die and was not resurrected and came back to life. That never happened. So in that sense, the book will be in most aspects very flawed and unreliable, and just not a true reflection of history. So that's the main problem with that. Some people sees a kind of invisible coming of the Lord in, let's say, 70 AD or so. There's quite a strong view on that also. And the problem here is, again, that, the way that the second coming is described, for example, Jesus himself in the Gospels describes it as he will come with great power and glory. So if we take these descriptions that Jesus gave us about his second coming seriously, I believe then we must believe that the second coming has not yet taken place. Now, the second view, we can maybe, as I've said, there are four different views, but let's just go to the second view, what's also called the spiritual or the symbolic or the idealist view. Now, what is different here is this view actually uses what we would call the allegorical method of interpretation. Now, it's very important for the reader to understand that there are actually two kinds of methods of interpreting literature within the church. Now, the Old Testament writers, and even in the time of Jesus, in Jewish circles, the first person that used the allegorical method, it's originated with the Greeks, were Philo. He lived slightly after the time of Jesus. And this way of interpreting only entered the church by the time of Pontius, that was about 150 or so AD. So the early writers in St. John didn't know or didn't use the allegorical method. Now, what is the allegorical method? People would, often readers would think that when there's symbols involved, it's obviously allegory. You should need, the allegorical method, but that's not the case here. Allegorical method actually means that behind that what we read is a deeper meaning. It's hidden. So the interpreter must try and find this deeper meaning. And he should not use the obvious meaning, but he should look for a deeper meaning. So it's not just related to symbols because they are symbols, because even if you have the normal method of interpretation, which is the other way of interpreting, also called the literal method, in that case, we do make provision for symbols, metaphor, all those kind of stuff is obviously when we read about Jesus, for example, in Revelation 4 and 5, he's described as a lamb with horns and eyes. Now, obviously, Jesus is not a lamb. This is a symbol.
And it's also said a sword comes out of his mouth,
Yeah, I've seen a prominent scholar saying we can't use the normal method or the literal method because then Jesus would be a lamb. No, that's absolutely nonsense. Because the normal method would just use normal rules of understanding language. So when it's a symbol or it's a metaphor, obviously we understand it in that way. But the allegorical method is something else. It reads in a deeper meaning, and we'll come back to that later on. So in this school of thinking, using this method, for the most part, we have very in broad terms, the view that it's a struggle between good and bad, between good and evil, and that eventually good will
triumph.
Will triumph, yeah. And we should see it in those broad terms, but they're not really interested in the details given in the book, because when you go to the allegorical method, the details are not totally unimportant. It's just everybody has a different way of understanding these things, because everyone reads a different meaning into a deeper meaning into the text. So that's not important. All that's important is to understand the overall picture, which is the struggle between good and evil. So in a certain sense, this view actually negates the idea of prophecy very much. It doesn't take it as a prophecy seriously, the book as a prophecy seriously. Then we have the historicist view. They believe that what we find in the book of Revelation actually describes events throughout history. So they'll take various major events through the history of, especially European history, and they would relate it to the events described in the Revelation, and they would see also the Pope as the Antichrist. So that's very important in this view, is the Pope is the Antichrist, not a particular Pope, but the popes in all the popes are the Antichrist. And then the last view is the futurist view, and they believe that most of the things referred to in Revelation still has a future application. It's not yet been fulfilled, and there are also various schools, but as we proceed, we'll discuss this in more detail.
Yeah. So I actually want to pose this question to Carel. When it comes to Revelation, I find that some people tend to go a bit off the rails, especially when it comes to prophecy, and sometimes people almost leverage this to create a bit of panic. If you look at the role of the church in, looking at Revelation, the modern church, how should it be approached? What would be, in your mind, the correct way?
Actually, you said these are secular like theories, but it is more than that. As I understand it, these are full models of how people in the church try to understand Revelation.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what you have just said, you can fit into one of those models or schools. For instance, the historical method, they try to fit Revelation into the first and second coming of Christ. They try to force history into that, and to force certain events of history into that, and to create a kind of a chart. Or so in that case, you will typically get people who tells you the Roman Catholic Church is the Antichrist, or others might say Hitler is the Antichrist, or this kind of things. So when I read this book of David Pawson, he said you should actually move between these schools, try to find the best fit for the text, because sometimes the one will work, and other times another one will work. But I think the most safest way to do this is to really engage with the text itself, to deeply study the text, to make sure you don't read something from the outside into the text which is not there, and also to compare it with other parts of Scripture where it talks about the same event or the same prediction or so. So my way that I will try to, the best way I think to interpret the Revelation is to stay as close as the text itself as possible, and to let the Bible describe itself using the Old Testament, as we've said, and using other prophecies like, for instance, Daniel, where some of these things are also mentioned. And also where Jesus spoke in, I think it's Matthew 24, if I remember correct, about the last things, where there are also a lot of parallel events mentioned. Maybe, Willie, you can also say what you think will be the best way to...
I believe that the Revelation should be read, as you've said, closely together with the rest of Scripture. And throughout Scripture, there are lots of other prophecies. And in a certain sense, we'll find that Revelation actually repeats those prophecies. And many passages in Revelation are closely related, are just a word-by-word repetition of other prophecies. So I believe that we should take this into account. This is very important. So when we go into Revelation, we should be very careful, I believe, not to jump to conclusions. Because, it's easy just to jump to conclusions. But when we try and systematically study the book and understand every part of the book and see how the whole fits together and so forth, which part is actually refers to the time of St. John himself, what are actually the prophetic part of the book, because not everything is prophecies. And in the prophecies, what is sort of the outline of the prophecy? Or the prophecies concerned here? What is the kind of future story that's been told here? We have to try and figure these things out, and I think that's very important. So we should not jump to conclusions very fast. We often hear, for example, this or that leader is the Antichrist. I've heard people saying Henry Kissinger is the Antichrist, and I've heard many other names mentioned that he or she should be, or he should be the Antichrist. But I just think that we should be very careful, because so often these people, that's referring to these different persons in our own time, they try and find the Antichrist in our own time. So they have a strong belief that the second coming will take place in our time. Now, it's true and it's good to expect the coming of the Lord in each generation. Nothing wrong with that. But once you take that so serious that you believe it must be in your time, and you start identifying figures, you can really go wrong. And in the end of the day, people would start, or do start, saying, but I mean, you've applied this to that person and that person and that person. it seems that, what kind of prophecy is this? It's so vague, you have no idea what's going on here. So we should actually, when we interpret the book, take it serious. We should be careful in what we're doing. If it's divine inspired, as I believe, then we should not take it lightly and just jump in and start saying things that, just a short while later would be shown to be wrong. Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest risks that or mistakes I see people make, is trying to fit that, what do they say, a square peg into a round hole, where they try to make it applicable to this day and age, and there's a definite risk.
It's not impossible. It can be related.
It could be, but
come a time in our day and age that these things start going into fulfillment, but we should not force this onto the text and believe it will be in our day that these things happen.
Yes, yeah, and I think if you look at, let me ask you this way, instead of giving you guys my opinion, if you had to pick a theme for the Bible that comes to this conclusion at the end of Revelation, what would be that one single theme? Carel, you're smiling.
Oh, I read a very nice story. Maybe I can just read it. It's
Please,
not long. A story has circulated in America which highlights the point. Well, this point is actually that it is written for ordinary people, though it sounds like an apocryphal preacher's tale. Apparently, some theological students were tired and confused by lecturers on the apocalyptic, so they decided to have a game of basketball in the campus gym. While playing, they noticed a black janitor reading his Bible while waiting to lock up. They asked which part he was studying and were surprised to find he was going through Revelation. "You don't understand that, do you?" "Sure do," he answered. "What's it about then?" With eyes lit up and a broad smile came the reply, "Simple. Jesus wins." I think that summarizes the main message of Revelation very nicely.
Yeah,
Jesus.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Isn't that nice, eh?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah, and I believe we should see the book of Revelation within the whole story of the gospel. In the previous set of lectures, we discussed the book of Genesis, especially the primeval history, chapters 1 to 11 in some detail. And that's how everything started. And then we have the cross of Jesus and his death for salvation. And this, in a certain sense, amazing event that divided history into the past and the future. So although we're living after the time of Christ, in a sense, we are now looking towards the future, whereas previously the past played a very important role. Now, so from the past, starting off from Genesis, now we're looking towards the future and the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. And we have this expectation that he will return in great power and glory because he's been resurrected. So the death and the resurrection of Jesus and his death, dying for our sins, and the salvation of the world, which is such a major event, God sending his own son to die, the word becoming flesh. But this, his return, is just as a magnificent and important event that we are still expecting. And so in terms of the gospel and the story of the gospel, from the time of the very beginnings of Genesis, in the end, it's not only that Jesus has brought salvation, but it's also that he will return and that he will rule. And I think that's very much part of the story. The victorious return of our Lord. And this is, I think, the book of Revelation is, I think, the one book in the Bible that captures that most powerfully. there are definitely other prophecies also in the New Testament that captures it. But this one, I believe, the book of Revelation, especially certain parts of Revelation, which we'll discuss later on, chapter 19 and so forth. It's a vivid expression and description of the return of the Lord.
Yeah. When we can also say that in Revelation we find the conclusion of history and of the whole Bible. I've written somewhere that someone said, what would the Bible have been like if there was no book like Revelation? If it ended, for instance, with the letter of Jude, how disappointing would that be? Second generation church who was corrupted in Jude, and it would be so incomplete. So then somebody said that Genesis should be the first book in the Bible, and Revelation have to be the last book in the Bible. So this conclusion really, even though we don't understand all of it, it really gives us that deep sense of peace, that God is in control and that Jesus wins, as that guy said.
Absolutely. So, sorry, Willie, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that although the book is difficult, with all the symbols and all these things, it's actually so marvelous that it has kept the church busy for 2,000 years. And we're still thinking about the book, discussing the book. If it were not written in this way, maybe after a few years, the book would have been sort of lost its, luster, and, people, the church would felt that, okay, now we understand everything and we're just waiting. But now we're waiting, but we have this marvelous book that we're discussing, and we keep discussing it because it has such marvelous depths and details and things that we can recover, and hidden secrets, if I can call it this. And this is such a wonderful book, and it kept the church busy. And it's just wonderful that the Lord has, in His wisdom, did it in this way, revealed Himself in this way.
And even if it's, sorry, Carel, go ahead.
Sorry, LeVay. I've read somewhere that somebody said, John must have referred back to Isaiah, because here he quoted Isaiah and here he quoted this one and that one. And I thought, no, this person is missing the point. It was not John. It was the original author who inspired Isaiah and all these prophets, and now he's speaking and bringing all to conclusion. And somehow, for me, Revelation helps you to see the person behind the Bible, the Lord Himself, His mind, His understanding, His perspective, jumping between earth and heaven all the time, looking from the Lord's view. Maybe that's why it kept people busy, because it is the wisdom and the depth of our God's his revelation of what's going on that really kept us busy and kept us going. So that's why it's truly a magnificent book for me also. Yeah.
I like the way you express it, jumping between heaven and earth. And, even though Revelation is apocalyptic, I do see it as a very positive book because of what happens at the end. There's judgment, but there's rebirth.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to ask you guys just a one final thought. Over the next 11 months, we're going to be busy with Revelation. Did you guys want to sort of touch on how we are going to approach it and attack this topic? Just so our listeners know what to expect.
Something about the systematic way we will do that.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that from my perspective, I think, you can go very deep into the different passages and so forth. So we would try to give a sort of an overview. So we will more or less take a session to discuss a chapter, I think, more or less. So it's a broad overview of the book, enough detail, but not too detailed and dug into too much specifics. That's not unimportant, but that can keep us busy for a very, very long time. So if we have a project for a year, which we have in this case, I think we will more or less try to do a chapter during each discussion session that we have, more or less. Yeah.
Beautiful. I think that's great. Carel, anything else to add?
I'm very excited. Every time I get back to this book and delve into it and read through it, I'm deeply blessed. It is the only book, well, in the New Testament, where you get this promise that the one who reads this prophecy aloud will be blessed. So we are looking forward to be blessed as we will be busy with this book.
Absolutely. Beautiful. Well, thank you very much for your time. For our listeners, I really look forward to you guys joining us on this journey. This will be again posted on YouTube with all of the links. I have links on there to Willie's blog if you guys want to do some additional reading and studying, as well as Willie's second book in the series about the Nephilim. And then if you guys needed to email us with questions, info@thebiblegps.com is the right address to use. Well, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My pleasure.